My name is Reagan, and I'm going to be reading from Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Moby-Dick. Chapter 1. New Means. Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse, and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself having little or no money in my purse, and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim Ishmael. Whenever it is a damp, some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse, and nothing particularly to interest me on shore, be reading from sail about a little and watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim Ishmael. Whenever it is a damp, some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse, and nothing particularly to interest me on shore, be reading from sail about a little and watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself which a few hours previous were out of sight of land, look at the crowds of water gazers there. Footnote, the Roman statesman Cato the Younger, 95 to 46 BC, killed himself rather than submit to Caesar. Circumambulate the city of a dreamy Sabbath afternoon. Go from Corlear's Hook to Coenties Slip.
As excited. Hello and welcome to Micah Reads. We are continuing a book. Well, we're starting a book. Scarlet Letter. Wow, the Scarlet Letter. You guys excited? I'm pretty excited. So, because I can do whatever I want on this channel, I've decided to start on page 41, which is chapter 1's beginning. You can't see it. Chapter 1, The Prison Door. I'm skipping this first 40 pages of introduction because, man, that looks like somebody else's problem to me. So, let's jump right into it. Chapter 1, The Prison Door. A throng of bearded men in sad-colored garments and gray steeple-crowned hats, intermixed with women, some wearing hoods and others bareheaded, was assembled in front of a wooden edifice, the door of which was heavily timbered with oak and studded with iron spikes. The founders of a new colony, whatever utopia of human virtue and happiness they might originally project, have invariably recognized it among their earliest practical necessities to allot a portion of the virgin soil as a cemetery, and another portion as the site of a prison. In accordance with this rule, it may be safely assumed that the forefathers of Boston had built the first prison house, somewhere in the vicinity of Cornhill, almost as seasonably as they had marked out the first burial ground on Isaac Johnson's lot, and round about his grave, which subsequently became the nucleus of all congregated sepulchres in the old churchyard of King Chapel. Certainly it is that some 15 or 20 years after the settlement of the town, the wooden jail was already marked with weather stains and other indications of age, which gave yet darker aspect to its beetle brown and gloomy front. The rust on the ponderous ironwork of its oaken door looked more antique than anything else in the world, Like all that pertains to crime, it seemed never to have any youthful era. Before this ugly edifice, and between it and the wheel track of the street, was a grass plot, much overgrown with burdock, pigweed, apple peru, such unsightly vegetation, which evidently found something congenial in the soil that had become so early born in the black flower of civilized society, a prison. But on one side of the portal, and rooted at the threshold, was a wild rose bush covered in this month of June with its delicate gems, which might be imagined to offer their fragrance and fragile beauty to the prisoner as he went in, and to the condemned criminal as he came forth to his doom, in token that the deep heart of nature could pity and be kind to him. This rose bush, by strange chance, had been kept alive in history, but whether it had been merely survived out of the stern old wilderness so long after the fall of gigantic pines and oaks that originally overshadowed it, or whether there is a fair authority for believing that it had sprung up under the footsteps of sainted Anne Hutchinson as she entered the prison door, we shall not take upon us to determine, finding it so directly on the threshold of our narrative, which is now about to issue from an inauspicious portal. We should hardly do otherwise than pluck one of its flowers and present it to the reader. It may serve, let us hope, to symbolize some sweet moral blossom that may be found along the track, or relieve the darkening close of a tale of human frailty and sorrow. And that is the end of chapter 1. So, what have we learned in this chapter so far? Pretty much nothing, but it's an introduction into the surroundings, the scene that this is going to play out. This chapter, of course, called The Prison Door, initially sets the ground of the colony that the place shows up. It's like, oh, first there was built a cemetery, and then in this town there was a prison immediately afterwards. So the town has a bit of a darkness to it. So we're being led up to this. We're talked about, oh, here's how there's a bunch of vegetation around it, how sometimes it still thrives despite being dominated by man, where oaks and stuff have gone down. These smaller vegetation things still survived, and specifically a rose bush is sitting right in the doorway to this prison. And many prisoners have walked by it seeing this rose bush. People on their way to die, people on their way to be captured, and people just in the prison have seen this rose bush, and they're like, oh look, there's a rose bush here. Maybe it's some sign of hope. We don't know yet. Again, it's just the very beginning of the book. But that's chapter 1, guys. I'm going to break each video into a single chapter. Is that going to make for 8-minute videos? Yes, it will. Sometimes it'll be 30-minute videos. Depends on how long the chapters are. But I hope you stick with me. I'm going to try and make this entertaining. Every single chapter, I'll be breaking down how the chapter went down, why the characters are acting the way they're acting, all that stuff, my own opinions. You're going to get everything at the end of every single chapter, and it's going to be beautiful. So if you want to stick with me, we're going to be getting through the rest of this book. Thank you very much for joining me for this one. I'll see you in the next chapter. Goodbye. And welcome back, guys. Thank you for joining me for chapter 2. Didn't expect you to come back, but you did, and I really appreciate that. So, again, actually, this is not again. This is the first time. I'm sorry I'm sick. I didn't mention it before, but it's kind of obvious. As these videos go on, I did a downhill motion. I didn't mean to do that. The videos are going to be getting better. My voice will be getting better, is what I meant to say. The sickness is going to be going down. I'm going to normalize. Anyways, I wasted enough of your time. Let's get started. Chapter 2. The Marketplace. The grass plot before the jail in Prison Lane on a certain summer morning not less than 2 centuries ago was occupied by a pretty large number of inhabitants of Boston, all with their eyes intently fastened on an iron-clamped oaken door. Amongst any other population, or at a later period in history of New England, the grim rigidity that petrified the bearded physiognomies of these good people would have augured some awful business in the hand. It could have betokened nothing short of an anticipated execution of some noted culprit, on whom the sentence of a legal tribunal had but confirmed the verdict of public sentiment. But in that early severity of the Puritan character, an inference of this kind could not so indubitably be drawn. It might be the sluggish bondservant or the undutiful child, whom his parents had given over to the civil authority, was to be corrected at the whipping post. It might be the antinomian, a Quaker, or another heterodox religious, that has been scourged out of time, or an idle and vagrant Indian, whom the white man's firewater had made riotous about the streets, was to be driven with stripes into the shadow of the forest. It might be, too, that a witch, like the old Mistress Hibbins, the bitter-tempered widow of the magistrate, was to die upon the gallows. In either case, there was much the same solemnity of demeanor on the parts of the spectators as benefited a people amongst whom religion and law were almost identical, and in whose characters both were so thoroughly interfused that the mildest and severest acts of public discipline were alike made venerable and awful. Meager, indeed, and by cold, was the sympathy of the transgressor might look for, from such bystander as a scaffold. On the other hand, a penalty, which by in our days would infer a degree of mocking, infamy, and ridicule, might then be invested with some as stern as the dignity of the punishment of death itself. It was a circumstance to be noted, on a summer morning when our story begins its course, that the women, of whom there were several in the crowd, appeared to take peculiar interest in whatever penal infliction might be expected to ensue. The age had not so much refinement, and in any case of impropriety, restrained the wearers of a petticoat and farthingale from stepping forth into the public ways, and wedging not their unsubstantial persons, if occasion were, into the throng nearest to the scaffold at an execution. Morally as well as maternally, there was a coarser fibre in those wives and maidens of old English birth and breeding than their fair descendants, separated from them by the series of 6 or 7 generations. For throughout the chain of ancestry, every successive mother who has transmitted to her child a fainter bloom, a more delicate and briefer beauty, and a slighter physical frame, if not a character of less force and solidity than her own. The women who were now standing at the prison doors stood within less than a half-century of the period when the man like Elizabeth had been not altogether unsuitable for a representative of the sex. They were countrywomen, and beef and ale of their native land, with a moral diet of wit more refined, entered largely into their composition. The bright morning sun, therefore, shone on broad shoulders and well-developed busts, and on round and ruddy cheeks that had ripened on the far-off island, and had hardly yet grown paler or thinner in the atmosphere of New England. There was, moreover, a boldness and a rotundity of speech among these matrons, as most of them seemed to be, that would startle us in the present day, whether in respect to the purport or its volume of tone. "Good wives," said a hard-featured dame of 50, "I tell ye a piece of my mind. It would be greatly for the public behoof if we women, being of mature age and church members in good repute, should have the handling of such malefactresses as this Hester Prynne. What think ye, gossips, of this hussy stood up for judgment before us 5 that are now here in the knot together? Would she come off with such a sentence as the worship magistrate have awarded? Marry, I trow not." "People say," said another, "that the Reverend Master Dimmadale, her godly pastor, takes it very grievously to heart that such a scandal should have come up in this congregation." "The magistrates are God-fearing gentlemen, but merciful over much. That is the truth," added a third, autumnal matron. "At the very least, they should have put a brand of hot iron on Hester Prynne's forehead. Madam Hester would have winced at that, I warrant me. But she, a naughty baggage, little will she care what they put upon the bodice of her gown. Why, look you, she may cover it with a brooch or some such heathenish adornment, and so walk the streets as brave as ever." "Ah, but," interposed, more softly, a young wife holding a child by the hand, "let her cover the mark as she will, the pang of it will be always in her heart." "What do we talk of marks and brands, whether on the bodice of her gown or the flesh of her forehead?" cried another female, the ugliest, as well as the most pitiless of the self-constituted judges. "This woman has brought shame on us all, and ought to die. There's not a law for it, truly there is, both in Scripture and the statute book. Then let magistrates, who have made it of no effect, thank themselves if their own wives and daughters go astray." "Mercy on us, good wife," exclaimed a man in the crowd. "There is no virtue in women, save for what springs from a wholesome fear of the gallows. That is the hardest word yet. Hush now, gossips, for the lock is turning in the prison door, and here comes Mistress Prynne herself." The door of the jail being flung open from within, there appeared in the first place, like a black shadow emerging into the sunshine, the grim and grisly presence of the town beadle, with a sword by his side and a staff of his office in his hand. That was a run-on sentence. Anyway, sorry guys. This personage prefigured and represented in his aspect the whole dismay severity of the puritanical code of law, which it was his business to administer in his final and closest application to the offender. Stretching forth the official staff in his left hand, he laid his right upon the shoulder of a young woman, whom he thus drew forward, until on the threshold of the prison door she repelled him by an action marked with natural dignity and force of character, and stepped into the open air, as if by her own free will. She bore in her arms a child, a baby of some 3 months, who winked and turned aside its little face from the too vivid light of day, because its existence hereto had been brought acquainted only with the gray twilight of a dungeon, or other darksome apartment of the prison. When the young woman, the mother of this child, stood fully revealed before the crowd, it seemed to be her first impulse to clasp the infant closely to her bosom. Not so much by an impulse of motherly affection, as that she might thereby conceal a certain token, which was wrought or fastened into her dress. In a moment, however, wisely judging that one token of her shame would but poorly serve to hide another, she took the baby on her arm, and with a burning blush, and yet a haughty smile, and glance that would not be abashed, looked around at her townspeople and neighbors. On the breast of her gown, in fine red cloth, surrounded with an elaborate embroidery and fantastic flourishes of gold thread, appeared the letter A. It was so artfully done, and with so much fertility and gorgeous luxuriance of fancy, that it had all the effect of lasting and fitting decoration to the apparel which she wore, and which was of a splendor in accordance with the taste of the age, but greatly beyond what was allowed by the sumptuary regulations of the colony. The young woman was tall, with a figure of perfect elegance on a large scale. She had a dark and abundant hair, so glossy that it threw off the sunshine with a gleam, and a face which, besides being beautiful from regularity of feature and richness of complexion, had the impressiveness belonging to a marked brow and deep black eyes. She was ladylike, too, after the manner of the feminine gentility of those days, characterized by a certain state and dignity, rather than by the delicate evanescence and indescribable grace which now recognize as its indication. And it never had Hester Prynne appeared more ladylike in the antique interpretation of the term than as she issued from the prison. Those who had before known her, and expected to behold her dimmed and obscured by a disastrous cloud, were astonished, and even startled to perceive how her beauty shone out, and made a halo of the misfortune and ignominy in which she was enveloped. It may be true that to a sensitive observer there was something exquisitely painful in it. Her attire, which indeed she had wrought in the occasion in prison, and modeled after her own fancy, seemed to express the attitude of her spirit, desperate recklessness of her mood, by its wild and picturesque peculiarity. But the point which drew all eyes, and, if it were transfigured the wearer, so that both men and women who had been familiar or acquainted with Hester Prynne were now impressed as if they beheld her for the first time. This was the Scarlet Letter. Roll credits! So fantastically embroidered and illuminated upon her bosom, it had the effect of a spell, taking her out of the ordinary relations with humanity and enclosing her in a sphere by herself. "She hath good skill at needle, that's certain," remarked one of the female spectators. "But did ever a woman, before this brazen hussy, contrive such a way of showing it? Why, gossip, what is it but to laugh in the faces of our godly magistrates, and make a pride out of what they worthy gentlemen meant for punishment?" "It were well," muttered the most iron-visaged of the old dames, "if we stripped Madam Hester's rich gown off her dainty shoulders, and as for the red letter she hath stitched so curiously, I'll bestow a rag of mine to rheumatic flannel to make a fitter one." "Oh, peace, neighbors, peace," whispered their youngest companion. "Do not let her hear you. Not a stitch in that embroidered letter, but she had felt it in her heart." The grim beadle now made a gesture with his staff. "Make way, good people, make way in the king's name," cried he. Open a passage, and I promise ye, Mistress Prim, shall be set wherever man, woman, and child may have fair sight of her brave apparel. From this time till our past meridian, a blessing on the righteous colony of Massachusetts, where iniquity is dragged out into the sunshine. Come along, Madam Hester, and show your scarlet letter in the marketplace. A lane was forthwith opened through the crowd of spectators, preceded by the beadle and the attendant on a regular procession of stern-browed men and unkindly-visaged women. Hester Prynne set forth towards the place appointed for her punishment. A crowd of eager and curious schoolboys, understanding little of the matter in hand, except that it had given them a half-holiday, ran before her progress, turning their heads continually to stare into her face, and the winking baby in her arms, and the ignominious letter on her breast. It was no great distance in those days from prison door to marketplace. Measured by the prisoner experience, however, it may be reckoned a journey of some length, for, haughty as her demeanor was, she perchance underwent an agony from every footstep on those thronged to see her, as if her heart had been flung into the street for them all to spurn and trample upon. In our nature, however, there is a provision alike marvelous and merciful, that the sufferer should never know the intensity of what he endures by its present torture, but chiefly by the pang that rankles after it. With almost a serene deportment, therefore, Hester Prynne passed through this portion of her ordeal, and came to a sort of scaffold at the western extremity of the marketplace. It stood nearly beneath the caves of Boston's earliest church, and appeared to be a fixture there. In fact, this scaffold constituted a portion of the penal machine, which now, for 2 or 3 generations past, has been merely historical and traditionary among us, but was held in the old time to be as effectual an agent in the promotion of good citizenship as ever was the guillotine among the terrorists of France. It was, in short, the platform of the pillory, and above it rose the framework of that instrument of discipline, so fashioned as to confine the human head in its tight grasp and thus hold it up to the public gaze. I assume they mean a noose. The very idea of enormity was the embodied that it made the manifest in the contrivance of wood and iron. There had been no outrage, methinks, against our common nature. Whatever be the delinquency of the individual, no outrage more fragrant than the forbid the culprit to hide his face for shame as it were the essence of his punishment to do. In Hester Prynne's instance, however, as not unfrequently in other cases, her sentence bore that she could stand a certain time upon the platform, but without undergoing that gripe about the neck and confinement of the head, the proneness to which it was most devilish characteristics of this ugly engine. So not a noose, but like one of those like machines they like clamp your head and arms in, and then you're just kind of sitting there. Yup. Knowing well her part, she ascended a flight of wooden steps and was thus displayed to the surrounding multitude at about the height of a man's shoulders above the street. Had there been a papist among the crowd of Puritans, he might have seen in this beautiful woman, so picturesque in her attire and mien, and with the infant in her bosom, an object to remind him of the image of divine maternity, which so many illustrious painters have vied with one another to represent something which should remind him, and indeed, only by contrast, the sacred images of sinless motherhood, whose infant was to redeem the world. Here there was a taint of deepest sin in the most sacred quality of human life, working such effect that the world was only darker for this woman's beauty, and the more lost for the infant that she had borne. The scene was not without a mixture of awe, such as must always invest in the spectacle of guilt and shame in the fellow creature, afore society shall have grown corrupt enough to smile, instead of shuddering at it. The witness of Hester Prynne's disgrace had not yet passed beyond their simplicity. They were stern enough to look upon her death, had that been the sentence, without a murmur at severity, but had none of the heartlessness of other social state, which would only find the theme for jest in an exhibition like the present. Even had there been a disposition to turn the matter into ridicule, it might have been repressed and overpowered by the solemn presence of men no less dignified than the governor, and several of his counselors, a judge, a general, and the ministers of the town, all of whom sat or stood in a balcony of the meeting-house, looking down upon the platform. When such personages could constitute a part of the spectacle without risking the majesty or reverence of rank and office, it was safely to be inferred that the infliction of a legal sentence would have been an earnest and effectual meaning. Accordingly, the crowd was somber and grave. The unhappy culprit sustained herself as best woman might under the heavy weight of 1,000 unrelenting eyes, all fastened upon her and concentrated at her bosom. Ooh. It was almost intolerable to be born. Of an impulsive and passionate nature, she had fortified herself to encourage the stings and venomous stabs of public contumely, wreaking itself in a variety of insult. But there was a quality so much more terrible in the solemn mood of the popular mind that she longed rather to behold all of these rigid countenances, contorted with scornful merriment, and herself, the object. Had a roar of laughter burst from the multitude, each man, each woman, each little shrill-voiced child contributing their individual parts, Hester Prynne might have repaid them all with a bitter and disdainful smile. But under the leaden infliction which it was her doom to endure, she felt at moments as if she must need shrieks out of with full power of her lungs, and cast herself from a scaffold down upon the ground, or else go mad at once. Yet there were intervals when the whole scene in which she was the most conspicuous object seemed to vanish from her eyes, or at least glimmered indistinctly before them, like a mass of imperfectly shaped and spectral images. Her mind, and especially her memory, was preternally active, and kept bringing up other scenes with this roughly hewn street of a little town on the edge of western wilderness. Other faces then were lowering upon her from beneath the brims of their steeple-crowned hats. Reminiscences, the most trifling and immature passages of infancy, and school-days sports, childish quarrels, and little domestic traits of her maiden years came swarming back upon her, intermingling with recollections of whatever was gravest in her subsequent life. One picture precisely as vivid as another, as if all were similar importance or all alike a play. Possibly it was an instinctive device of her spirit to relieve itself by the exhibition of those phantasmagoric forms of the cruel weight and hardness of the reality. Be that as it might, the scaffold of the pillory was on a point of view that revealed Hester Prynne the entire track along which she had been treading since her happy infancy. Standing on that miserable eminence, she saw again her native village in Old England, and her paternal home, a decayed house of grey stone with poverty-stricken aspect, but retaining a half-obliterated shield of arms over the portal, a token of antique gentility. She saw her father's face, with his bald brow and reverend white beard that flowed over the old-fashioned Elizabethan ruff. Her mother's, too, with a look of heedful and anxious love, which it always wore in her remembrance, and which ever since her death had so often laid an impediment on a gentle remonstrance in their daughter's pathway. She saw her own face glowing with girlish beauty and illuminating all the interior of the dusty mirror in which she had been wont to gaze at. There she beheld another countenance of a man well stricken in years, a pale, thin, scarlet-like visage, with eyes dim and bleared by lamplight, that had been served them to pore over many ponderous books. Yet those bleared optics had strange penetrating power when it was their owner's purpose to read the human soul. This fight of the study in the cloister, as Hester Prynne's womanly fancy failed not to recall, was slightly deformed, with the left shoulder a trifle higher than the right. Next rose before her in memory a picture gallery, the intricate and narrow thoroughfares, the tall gray houses, the huge cathedrals, and the public edifices, ancient in date and quaint in architecture, of a continental city, where new life had awaited her, still in connection with the misshapen scholar, a new life, but feeding itself on time-worn materials like a tuft of green moss on a crumbling wall. Lastly, in lieu of those shifting scenes, came back the rude marketplace of the Puritan settlement, with all the townspeople assembled and leveling their stern regards at Hester Prynne. Yes, at herself, who stood on the scaffold of the pillory, an infant on her arm, and the letter A, in scarlet, fantastically embroidered with gold thread upon her bosom. Could it be true? She clutched the child so fiercely to her breast that it sent forth a cry. She turned her eyes downwards at the scarlet letter and even touched it with her finger to assure herself that the infant and the shame were real. Yes, these were her realities. All else had vanished. And now, we need to unpack that. We need to know what just happened, because that was a lot of big words that were unnecessarily thrown at us. So, let's break it down. We're introduced to a couple characters. Mainly Hester Prynne, the lady with the scarlet letter, the magistrate guy with a little stick that says, "Hey, I'm a magistrate," and then it's like 5 women who are like really judgy and we're not supposed to like them, I don't think, but we also just don't know if we're supposed to like them or not. So these women, these 5 women, are standing there and they're like, oh, we're all judgy and stuff, and we don't like women who are floozies and go out and have free sex and stuff like that. We don't like anyone that shows even the slightest indication that they might be more liberal in their appearance or in their actions. And so they're really, really just like strictly evil people, I guess. That's not a good way to put it. They're just really judgy. You know those like really like judgy women that you see in movies, and they're just like looking down their noses at everybody, and they're like, that's not how a lady acts. Yeah, but like trashier than that. That's how these women are. And so we're walked through like how these women are like judging, and all of a sudden out of the darkness comes the magistrate, and he's like, hey, look, I have a woman with me, and it's Hester Prynne. And Hester Prynne comes out, and she's like, look at me, I'm coming out with a baby. And they're like, wow, look, a baby. And then she like is like, oh wait, this baby is a badge of something that I've done wrong. We don't know what yet. Probably she had sex out of wedlock and had a kid. And so anyways, she's like, this baby is a token of me doing something I shouldn't have done. And she moves it aside because now she has a letter A on her embroidered on her that she embroidered herself on top of her dress. And the letter A represents adultery, maybe? I don't know. We haven't gotten to that. We just know that there's a letter that's stitched onto her dress. And so she's like, here's one badge, here's another badge of things that I shouldn't be. Yep. And so anyways, she gets out on the stage and she's got that look of like, I'm wearing this with pride. I'm not going to let you haters get me down. And so she's standing on that stage and she has to take this long walk through the crowd, and the magistrate's like, everybody get out of the way. We got to get this woman to the stands. And so they walk over to the stands, these stockade type things. And I think it wasn't super well explained, but they said that it holds your head. And so I assume it's either a noose or it's one of those clampy things. I think it's a clampy thing. And so she's walked over there. And this whole time it's like talking about how difficult it is for somebody on like death row, or how somebody is just like walking through a crowd and they've done something wrong, how difficult it is, and how not necessarily the going through the crowd's the most difficult part, but it definitely feels like it takes forever. But just reflecting on that later, the embarrassment of that is what is the hardest part of this process. And so she walks up to that stage and she's standing up there. And I think I don't know if she actually has to get in the clamps or she just has to stand on the stage for a while. I guess we'll find out. And so anyways, the clampy thing is on the stage and she's standing on the stage with her baby and she's like, it's about to get really embarrassing if I'm about to be clamped down. And that's the end of that. That's the whole chapter. It took a lot of pages to get through to that. If you have more information, if you got more from this chapter than I did, please put it down below. Help each other out, have discussions, all that stuff. I will be doing more analysis and helping you get through the conversation if you feel like having one down there. If not, that's okay too. It doesn't really matter to me. So, cool. Thanks for joining me, guys. Still going to be the same amount of sick in the next video because I think I'm just going to keep recording these today until I guess the light dies, but I do have a light there, so it's, yep. Anyways, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you in the next chapter. Bye. Hello and welcome back to Scarlet Letter. We're on chapter 3. Yeah, let's jump in. The recognition. From this intense consciousness of being the object of severe and universal observation, the wearer of the Scarlet Letter was at length relieved by discerning on the outskirts of the crowd a figure which irresistibly took possession of her thoughts. An Indian in his native garb was standing there. But the red men were not so infrequent visitors of the English settlements that one of them would have attracted any notice from Hester Prynne at such a time, much less would he have excluded all other objects and ideas from her mind. By the Indian's side, and evidently sustaining a companionship with him, stood a white man, clad in strange disarray of civilized and savage costume. He was small in stature, with a furrowed visage, which as yet could hardly be termed aged. There was a remarkable intelligence in his features, as if the person who had cultivated his mental part, that it could not fail to mold the physical to itself and become manifest as unmistakable tokens. Although a seemingly careless arrangement of his heterogeneous garb, he had endeavored to conceal or abate the peculiarity. It was sufficiently evident to Hester Prynne that one of his man's shoulders rose higher than the other. Again, on the first instance of perceiving that thin visage and a slight disformity of the figure, she pressed her infant to her bosom with so convulsive a force that the poor babe uttered another cry of pain. But the mother did not seem to hear it. Man, you gotta be nicer to your kids, you know? At his arrival in the marketplace, and some time before she saw him, a stranger had bent his eyes on Hester Prynne. It was carelessly at first, like a man chiefly accustomed to look inward, and to whom external matters are of little value and import, unless they bear relation to something within his mind. Very soon, however, his look became keen and penetrative. A writhing horror twisted itself across his features, like a snake gliding swiftly over them, and making one little pause with all its wreathed intervolutions in open sight. His face darkened with some powerful emotion, which nevertheless he so instantaneously controlled by an effort of his will that, save in a single moment, its expression might have passed for calmness. After a brief space, the convulsion grew almost imperceptible and finally subsided into the depths of his nature. When he found the eyes of Hester Prynne fastened on his own, and saw that she appeared to recognize him, he slowly and calmly raised his finger, made a gesture with it in the air, and laid it upon his lips. Then, touching the shoulder of a townsman who stood next to him, he addressed him in a formal and courteous manner. "I pray you, good sir," said he, "who is this woman? And wherefore is she here set up to public shame?" I don't know why I gave him that accent, but he's keeping it. "You must needs be a stranger in this region, friend," answered the townsman, looking curiously at the questioner and his savage companion. "Else you would surely have heard of Mistress Hester Prynne and her evil doings. She hath raised a great scandal, I promise you, in godly Master Dimmadale's church." "You say truly," replied the other. "I am a stranger, and have yet a wanderer sorely against my will. I have met with grievous mishaps by sea and land, and have been held in bonds among the heathen folk to the southward, and am now brought hither to this Indian, to be redeemed out of my captivity. Will it please you, therefore, to tell me of Hester Prynne's, have I said her name right, of this woman's offences, and what she has brought to here yonder scaffold?" "Truly, friend, methinks it must gladden your heart, after your troubles and sojourn in the wilderness," said the townsman, "to find yourself at length in a land where inquiry is searched out and punished in the sight of rulers and people, as here in our godly New England. Yonder woman, sir, you must know, was the wife of a certain learned man, English by birth, but who had long dwelt in Amsterdam, whence some good time agone he was minded to cross over and cast in his lot with us of the Massachusetts. To this purpose he sent his wife before him, remaining herself to look after some necessary affairs. Marry, good sir, in some 2 years or less, that the woman had been a dweller here in Boston, no tidings have come of this learned gentleman. Master Prynne and his young wife, look you, being left to her own misguidance." Aha, I conceive you," said the stranger with a bitter smile. "So learned a man as you to speak, I should have learned this too in his books, and who, by your favour, sir, might be the father of yonder babe. It is some 3 or 4 months old, I should judge, which Mistress Prynne is holding in her arms. Of a truth, friend, that matter remaineth a riddle, and the Daniel who shall expound it is yet a-wanting," answered the townsman. Madam Hester absolutely refuseth to speak, and the magistrates have laid their heads together in vain. Peradventure, the guilty one stands looking on this sad spectacle, unknown of a man, and forgetting that God sees him. "The learned man," observed the stranger with another smile, "should come himself to look into this mystery. It behooves him well if he be still in life," responded the townsman. "Now, good sir, our Massachusetts magistrates bethinking themselves that this woman is youthful and fair, and doubtless was strongly tempted to her fall. And that, moreover, as is more likely, her husband may be at the bottom of the sea. They have not been bold to put it in force of an extremity of our righteous law against her. The penalty thereof is death. But in their great mercy and tenderness of heart, they have doomed Mistress Prim to stand only a space of 3 hours on the platform of the pillory, and then and therefore, for the remainder of her natural life, wear a mark of shame upon her bosom. A wise sentence, remarked the stranger, gravely bowing his head. Thus she will be given sermon against sin until the ignominious letter be engraved upon her tombstone. It irks me, nevertheless, that the partner of her inquiry should not, at least, stand on the scaffold by her side. But he will be known. He will be known. He will be known. He bowed courteously to the communicative townsman, and whispering a few words to his Indian attendant, they both made their way through the crowd. While this passed, Hester Prynne had been standing on her pedestal, still with a fixed gaze towards the strangers, so fixed gaze that, at moments of intense absorption, all other objects in the visible world seemed to vanish, leaving only him and her. Such an interview, perhaps, would have been more terrible than even to meet him, as she now did, with a hot midday sun burning down upon her face and lighting up its shame, with a scarlet token of infamy on her breast. With a sin-born infant in her arms, with a whole people drawn forth as to a festival, sharing at the features that should have been seen only at the quiet gleam of the fireside in the happy shadow of a home, or beneath the matrimony veil at church. Dreadful as it was, she was conscious of a shelter in the presence of these 1,000 witnesses. It was better to stand thus, with so many betwixt him and her, than to greet him, face to face, they two alone. She fled for refuge, as it were, to the public exposed, and dreaded the moment when his protection should be withdrawn from her. Involved in these thoughts, she scarcely heard a voice behind her until it repeated her name more than once, in a loud and solemn tone, audible to the whole multitude. "Hearken unto me, Hester Prynne," said the voice. It has been noticed that directly over the platform on which Hester Prynne stood was a kind of balcony or open gallery appended to the meeting house. It was a place whence proclamations wont to be made amidst an assemblage of the magistrates, all with the ceremonial that attended such public observances in those days. Here to witness a scene which we are describing sat Governor Bellingham himself, with 4 sergeants about his chair, bearing halberds as a guard of honor. He wore a dark feather in his hat, a border of embroidery on his cloak, and a black velvet tunic underneath. A gentleman advanced in years, and with a hard experience written in his wrinkles, he was not ill-fitted to be the head and representative of a community, which owed its origin and progress, and its present state of development, not to the impulses of youth, but to the stern-tempered energies of manhood, and the somber sagacy of age, accomplishing so much precisely because it imagined and hoped so little. The other eminent characters by whom the chief ruler was surrounded were distinguished by dignity of mien, belonging to a period when the forms of authority were felt to possess the sacredness of divine institutions. They were doubtless good men, just and sage, but out of the whole human family, it would not have been easy to select the number of wise and virtuous persons who should be less capable of sitting in judgment on an erring woman's heart and distangling its mesh of good and evil, and the sages of rigid aspect towards whom Hester Prynne now turned her face. She seemed conscious, indeed, and whatever sympathy she might expect lay in the larger and warmer heart of the multitude. For she lifted her eyes towards the balcony, the unhappy woman grew pale and trembled. The voice which had called her attention was that of the Reverend and famous John Wilson, the eldest clergyman of Boston, a great scholar like most of his contemporaries in the profession, and withal a man of kind and genial spirit. This last attribute, however, had been less carefully developed than his intellectual gifts, and was in truth rather a matter of shame than self-congratulation with him. There he stood with a border of grizzled locks beneath his skull-cap, while his gray eyes, accustomed to the shaded light of the study, were winking like those of Hester's infant and the unadulterated sunshine. He looked like the darkly engraved portraits which we see prefixed to old volumes of sermons, which had no right no more right than one of these portraits would have to step forth as he now did, and meddle in the questions of human guilt, passion, and anguish. Hester Prynne, said the clergyman, I have striven with my young brother here, under whose preaching of word you have been privileged to sit. Here Mr. Wilson laid his hand on the shoulder of a pale young man beside him. Oh, that wasn't him talking, that was just a description, sorry. I have sought, I say, to persuade this godly youth that he should deal with you, here, in the face of heaven, and before these wise and upright rulers, in hearings of all the people as touching the vileness and blackness of your sin. Knowing your natural temper better than I, he could better judge the arguments to use, whether of tenderness or terror, such as might prevail over your hardness and obstinacy, insomuch that you could no longer hide the name of him who tempted you to this grievous fall. But he opposes to me, with the young man's over-softness, albeit wise beyond his years, that if he were wrongly in the very nature of woman to force her to lay open her heart's secrets in such broad daylight in the presence of so great a multitude, truly as I sought to convince him, the shame lay in the commission of the sin, and not in the showing of its forth. What say you to it once more again, Brother Dimmesdale? Must it be thou or I that shalt deal with this poor sinner's soul? There was a murmur among the dignified and reverend occupants of the balcony, and Governor Bellingham gave an expression to its purport, speaking in an authoritative voice, although tempered with respect towards the youthful clergyman whom he had addressed. Good Master Dimmesdale, he said. Or said he. Wow, that was not worth correcting. The responsibility of this woman's soul lies greatly with you. It behooves you, therefore, to exhort her to repentance and to confession as a proof and consequences thereof. The directness of this appeal drew the eyes of the whole crowd upon the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale, a young clergyman who had come from one of the great English universities, bringing all the learning of the age into our wild forest land. His eloquence and religious fervor had already given the earnest of higher eminence in his profession. He was a person of very striking aspect, with a white, lofty, and impending brow, large, brown, melancholy eyes, and a mouth which, unless when he forcibly compressed it, was apt to be tremulous, expressing both nervous sensibility and vast power of self-restraint. Man, I bet this is the dude. I bet the priest is the guy who she had a kid with. Anyways, notwithstanding his high native gifts and scholarlike attainments, there was an air about this young minister, an apprehensive, a startled, half-frightened look, as of a being who felt himself quite astray and at a loss in the pathway of human existence, and could only be at ease in some seclusion of his own. Therefore, so far as his duties would permit, he trod in the shadowy bypaths, and thus kept himself simple and childlike, coming forth, when occasion was, with a freshness and fragrance and dewy purity of thought, which, as many people said, affected him like the speech of an angel. Such was the young man whom the Reverend Mr. Wilson and the governor had introduced so openly to the public notice, bidding him speak in the hearing of all men to the mystery of the woman's soul, so sacred even in its pollution. The trying nature of his position drove the blood from his cheek and made his lips tremulous. Speak to the woman, my brother, said Mr. Wilson. It is of moment to her soul, and therefore, as the worshipful governor says, momentous to thine own, and whose charge hers is. Exhort her to confess the truth. The Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale bent his head in silent prayer, as it seemed, and then came forward. Hester Prynne, said he, leaning over a balcony and looking down steadfastly into her eyes, thou hearest what this good man says, and seest the accountability under which I labor. If thou feeblest it to be for thy soul's peace, and that thy earthly punishment will thereby be made for effectual to salvation, I charge thee to speak out the name of thy fellow sinner and fellow sufferer, but not silent from any mistaken pity and tenderness for him. Believe me, Hester, though we were to step down from a high place and stand there beside thee on the pedestal of shame, yet better were it too than to hide a guilty heart through life. What can thy silence do for him, except it tempt him, yea, compel him, as it were, to hypocrisy, to sin? Heaven hath granted thee an open ignominy, and thereby thou mayest work out an open triumph over evil within thee and sorrow without. Take heed how thou deniest to him. Who perchance hath not the courage to grasp it for himself, the bitter, but wholesome cup that is now presented to thy lips. Man, he talks in a really complicated way. The young pastor's voice was tremulously sweet, rich, deep, and broken. I think I nailed it. The feeling that it so evidently manifested rather than direct purport of the words caused it to vibrate within all hearts and brought the listeners into one accord of sympathy. Even the poor baby at Hester's bosom was affected by the same influence, for it directed its hitherto vacant gaze towards Mr. Dimmesdale, and held up its little arms with a half-pleased, half-plaintive murmur. So powerful seemed the minister's appeal that the people could not believe that Hester Prynne would speak out the guilty name, or else that the guilty one himself, in whatever high or lowly place he stood, would be drawn forth by an inward and inevitable necessity and compelled to ascend the scaffold. Hester shook her head. "Woman, transgress not beyond the limits of heaven's mercy," cried the Reverend Mr. Wilson, more harshly than before. "That little babe hath been gifted with a voice to second and confirm the counsel which thou hast heard. Speak out the name, that in thy repentance may avail to the scarlet letter off thy breast." "Never," replied Hester Prynne, looking not at Mr. Wilson but into the deep and troubling eyes of the younger clergyman. "It is too deeply branded. We cannot take it off, and would that I might endure its agony as well as mine." "Speak, woman," said another voice, coldly and sternly, proceeding from the crowd about the scaffold. "Speak, and give your child a father." "I will not speak," answered Hester, turning pale as death, responding to this voice, which she too surely recognized. "And my child must seek a heavenly father. She shall she shall never know an earthly one." Interesting. "She will not speak," murmured Mr. Dimmesdale, who, leaning over the balcony with his hand upon his heart, had awaited the result of his appeal. He now drew back, a long respiration. "Wonder strength and generosity of a woman's heart, she will not speak." Discerning the impracticable state of the poor culprit's mind, the elder clergyman, who had carefully prepared himself for the occasion, addressed to the multitude a discourse on sin in all its branches, but with a continual reference to the ignominious letter. So forcibly did he dwell upon this symbol for the hour or more during which his periods were rolling over the people's heads, that it assumed new terrors in their imagination, and seemed to derive its scarlet hue from the flames of the infernal pit. Hester Prynne, meanwhile, kept her place upon the pedestal of shame with glazed eyes and an air of weary indifference. She had borne that morning all that nature could endure, and as her temperament was not of the order that escapes from too intense suffering by a swoon, her spirit could only shelter itself beneath a stony crust of insensibility, while the faculties of animal life remained entire. In this state, the voice of the preacher thundered remorselessly, but unavailingly upon her ears. The infant, during the latter portion of her ordeal, pierced the air with its wailings and screams. She strove to hush it mechanically, but seemed scarcely to sympathize with its trouble. With the same hard demeanor, she was led back to prison and vanished from the public gaze within its iron-clamped portal. It was whispered by those who peered after her that the scarlet letter threw a lurid gleam upon the dark passageway of the interior. And that's the end of chapter 3. So, man, we got a lot to analyze again. A lot of new characters, I think. So there's Reverend Wilson, and there's Reverend Dimmesdale of the Dimmesdale Dimmadome. And so basically she's standing on the scaffold thing, and she recognizes a guy hiding out in the crowd, and he's standing next to a Native American man. And the guy in the crowd is a little bit shorter. One of his shoulders is sloped down where the other one is up, and he's just a short-statured guy. And so she recognizes him from her past, because in the previous chapter, she was going through some flashbacks about how where she stands, she can actually see where her entire history has taken place. Like, her house is right there, and she recalls being inside her house with somebody who had a sloped shoulder like that. She doesn't describe who it is, but she says that person, or she just recalls that person. And so we don't know yet anything, but this guy, he walks up to one of the townspeople and he's like, hey, so what's going on here? What's up with the girl up there with the red thing on her? And the guy explains to him, he's like, hey, this woman, she had a husband in England, and he sent her ahead of time to get some stuff done. And so he was supposed to follow her, but it's been 2 years. And if you haven't noticed, that baby's only like 4 months old. And so the guy with the sloped shoulders is like, yeah, so she definitely didn't sleep with her husband since her husband's not here. Yeah, that's weird. And the townsperson is like, her husband might be dead. So it's like, she might not have cheated, but also she might have cheated. The fact that we don't know is what's wrong here. The fact that she doesn't know is what's wrong here, is that without any sort of like confirmation, she just moved on and she didn't get remarried or anything. She just had a kid with somebody, and so that's wrong. And so we move back to her, and she's just standing up on that stage, and the Reverend Wilson's like, hey, Reverend Dimsdale, why don't you ask this girl, since she's of your parish, why don't you ask her how or who the person that she slept with is, so he can stand up on stage with her too. And also when they were, sorry, I missed something, but the guy with the sloped shoulders was asking what her punishment was. And so instead of being killed like you normally would have, because of the circumstances in which we don't know actually what happened to her husband, she wasn't being killed. She just has to put a red letter on her chest and wear that for the rest of her life and stand in the way of everyone like looking at her for 3 hours on the stage in front of the entire town. So everybody can see the letter, everybody can see the baby, everyone can judge her, and she has to stand up for 3 hours, and then she's free basically. And so anyways, we get back to her, and Mr. Wilson, or Reverend Wilson's like, yo, Dimsdale, Dimmadome. Sorry, that's from a thing. I should probably stop making the reference. So yo, Dimsdale, can you, since she's from your parish, she knows who she slept with, just get her to tell us. You're gonna know how she reacts to things. You're the best way to ask her. And so Dimsdale slowly walks up, and he's got kind of like a timid, like really well-learned kind of appearance to him. He's like, blah, 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 blah. It was so complicated, it was super hard to understand. Basically, he just asked, so who's this dude you've been sleeping with? And she was like, I'm not gonna tell you. But she said it more to Mr. Wilson than to Dimsdale. And she said, my kids can only know one daddy, and that daddy's the Lord. And so that's what she says. And they're like, I'm not happy with that answer. And she's like, well, that's just too bad. And so anyways, the Reverend Wilson goes on like a big old speech about how the letter red's going to represent all the fires of hell and stuff, and how she's committing sins, and he goes on this whole speech about that stuff. We don't actually get to read any of that speech. It just tells us he went on a rampagey speech about that. And then she's free, basically. They walk her back to the prison. I don't know if she's free, but I mean, she served out her punishment. I'm not sure what step 2 is, but that was step 1. So anyways, that's that whole chapter. We gotta find out who this sloped shoulder guy is. We gotta find out who she slept with. We gotta find out what happened to her husband. What's up with Dimsdale? Why is he so nervous about stuff? That's a lot to come, but we don't know. Right now, we're just sitting in the unknown stage. So thank you guys for joining me. I really hope to see you in the next chapter. If you have any questions, like always, just drop them down below. We'll all work together to get you an answer, okay? Have a good one, guys. Bye. Hey guys, and welcome back to another incredibly unusual chapter of Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Don't know if I ever mentioned the author before, but here we are. You'll notice some kind of weird lighting. It's because the sun's setting over there. Don't worry about it. I'm almost not sick anymore, which you'll be happy to know. Anyways, wasting enough time. Chapter 4, The Interview. After her return to the prison, Hester Prynne was found to be in a state of nervous excitement that demanded constant watchfulness, lest she should perpetrate violence on herself or do some half-frenzied mischief to the poor babe. As night approached, it proving impossible to quell her insubordination by rebuke of threats or punishment, Master Brackett, the jailer, thought it fit to introduce a physician. He described him as a man of skill in all Christian modes of physical science, and likewise familiar with whatever the savage people could teach, in respect to medicinal herbs and roots that grew in the forest. To say the truth, there was much need of a professional assistance, not merely for Hester herself, but still more urgently for the child, who, drawing in its sustenance from the maternal bosom, seemed to have drank in with it all the turmoil, the anguish and despair which pervaded the mother's system. It now writhed in convulsions of pain, and was a forcible type in its little frame of the moral agony which Hester Prynne had borne throughout the day. Closely following the jailer into the dismal apartment appeared that individual of single aspect, whose presence in the crowd had been of such deep interest to the wearer of the scarlet letter. He was lodged in the prison, not as suspect of any offense, but as the most convenient and suitable mode of disposing of him, until the magistrates could have conferred with the Indian sagamores respecting his ransom. His name was announced as Roger Chillingworth. The jailer, after ushering him in the room, remained a moment, marveling at the comparative quiet that followed his entrance, for Hester Prynne had immediately become still as death, although the child continued to moan. "Prithee, friend, leave me alone with my patient," said the practitioner. "Trust me, good jailer, you shall briefly have peace in your house, and I promise you, Mistress Prynne shall hereafter be more amenable to just authority than you may have ever found her hitherto before." "Nay, if your worship can accomplish that," answered Master Brackett, "I shall own you for a man of skill indeed. Verily the woman hath been like a possessed one, and there lacks little that I could take in hand to drive Satan out of her with stripes." The stranger had entered the room with a characteristic quietude of the profession to which he announced himself as belonging. Nor did his demeanor change when his withdrawal of the prison keeper left him face to face with the woman, whose absorbed notice of him in the crowd had intimidated so close a relation between himself and her. His first care was given to the child, whose cries indeed, as she lay writhing on the trundle bed, made it of peremptory necessity to postpone all other businesses the task of soothing her. He examined the infant carefully, and then proceeded to unclasp a leathern case, which he took from beneath his dress. It appeared to contain certain medicinal preparations, one of which he mingled with a cup of water. "My old studies in alchemy," observed he, "and my sojourn for above a year past among a people well versed in the kindly properties of simples, have made a better physician of me than many that claim the medical degree. Here, woman, the child is yours. She is none of mine. Neither will she recognize my voice or aspect as a father's. Administer the straw, therefore, with thine own hand." Hester repelled the offer of medicine at the same time, gazing with strongly marked apprehension into his face. "Wouldst thou avenge thyself on the innocent babe?" whispered she. "Foolish woman," responded the physician, half coldly, half soothingly. I keep switching up their voices. "What should ail me to harm this begotten and miserable babe? The medicine is potent for good, and were it my child, yea, mine own as well as thine, I could do no better for it." That's the accent I wanted him to have. As she hesitated, being in fact of no reasonable state of mind, she took the infant in his arms and himself administered the draught. It soon proved its efficacy and redeemed the leech's pledge. The moans of the little patient subsided, its convulsive tossings gradually ceased, and in a few moments, as the custom of young children after relief from pain, it sank into a profound and dewy slumber. The physician, as he had a fair right to be termed, next bestowed his attention on the mother. With calm and intense scrutiny, he felt her pulse, looked into her eyes, a gaze that made her heart shrink and shudder, because so familiar and yet so strange and cold, and finally, satisfied with the investigation, proceeded to mingle another draught. "I know not Leith nor Nepenthe," remarked he, "but I have heard many new secrets in the wilderness, and here is one of them. A recipe taught that an Indian taught me, in requital of some lessons of my own, that were as old as Paracelsus. Drink it, it may be less soothing than a sinless conscience. That I cannot give thee, but it will calm the swell and heaving of thy passion, like oil thrown on the waves of a tempestuous sea." He presented the cup to Hester, who received it with a slow, earnest look into his face, not precisely a look of fear, yet full of doubt and questioning as to what his purpose might be. She looked also at her slumbering child. "I have thought of death," said she. "I have wished for it, would even have prayed for it if it were fit such that I could pray for anything. Yet if death be in this cup, I bid thee think again. Ere thou beholdest me quaff it, see, it is even now at my lips." "Drink then," replied he, still with the same cold composure. "Dost thou know me so little, Hester Prynne? Are my purposes wont to be so shallow? Even if I imagine a scheme of vengeance that I could do better for my object than to let thee live, than to give thee medicines against harm and peril of life, so that this burdening shame may still blaze upon thy bosom?" That wasn't a question. As he spoke, he laid his long forefinger on the scarlet letter, which forthwith seemed to scorch into the Hester's breast, as if it had been red hot. He noticed her involuntary gesture and smiled. "Live therefore, and bear about thy doom with thee in the eyes of men and women, in the eyes of him who thou didst call thy husband, in the eyes of yonder child, and that thou mayest live, take of this draught." Without further expostulation or delay, Hester Prynne drained the cup, and at the motion of the man of skill, seated herself on the bed where the child was sleeping, while he drew the only chair which the room afforded and took his own seat beside her. She could not but tremble at these preparations, for she felt, having now done all that humanity or principle, or if so it were, or fine cruelty impelled him to do, for the relief of physical suffering, he was next to treat with her as a man whom she had most deeply and irreparably injured. "Hester," said he, "I ask not wherefore, now how thou hast fallen into the pit, or say rather thou hast ascended to the pedestal of infamy on which I found thee. The reason is not far to seek. It was my folly and thy weakness. I, a man of thought, the bookworm of great libraries, a man already in decay, having given my best years to feed the hungry dream of knowledge, what had I to do with youth and beauty like thine own? Misshapen from my birth hour, how could I delude myself with the idea that intellectual gifts might veil physical deformity in a young girl's fantasy? Men call me wise. If sages were ever wise in their own behoof, I might have foreseen all this. I might have known that, as I came out of the vast and dismal forest and entered this settlement of Christian men, the very first object to meet my eyes would be thyself, Hester Prynne, standing up, a statue of enormity before the people. Nay, from the moment when we came down the old church steps together, a married pair, I might have beheld the bale fire of that scarlet letter blazing at the end of our path. So is he her husband? Thou knowest, said Hester, for depressed as she was, she could not endure this last quiet stab at the token of her shame. Thou knowest I was frank with thee. I felt no love, nor feigned any. True, replied he. It was my folly, I have said it. But up to that epoch of my life, I had lived in vain. The world had been so cheerless. My heart was a habitation large enough for many guests, but lonely and chill, and without a household fire. I longed to kindle one. It seemed not so wild a dream, old as I was, and sombre as I was, and misshapen as I was, that the simple bliss which is scattered far and wide, for all mankind to gather up, might yet be mine. And so, Hester, I drew thee into my heart, into the innermost chamber, and sought to warm thee by the warmth which thy presence made there. I have greatly wronged thee, murmured Hester. We have wronged each other, answered he. Mine was the first wrong, then I betrayed thy budding youth to a false and unnatural relation with my decay. Therefore, as a man who has not thought and philosophized in vain, I seek no vengeance, plot no evil against thee. Between thee and me, the scale hangs fairly balanced. But Hester, the man lives who has wronged us both. Who is he? Ask me not, replied Hester Prynne, looking firmly into his face, that thou shalt never know. Never sayest thou, rejoined he with a smile of dark and self-relying intelligence. Never know him, believe me, Hester. There are few things, whether in the outward world or to a certain depth in the invisible sphere of thought, few things hidden from the man who devotes himself earnestly and unreservedly to the solution of a mystery. Thou mayest cover up the secret from the prying multitude. Thou mayest conceal it too from the ministers and magistrates, even though as thou didst today. And when they sought to wrench out the name out of thy heart, and keep thee a partner on thy pedestal. But as for me, I come to the inquest with other senses than they possess. I shall seek this man as I have sought truth in books, as I have sought gold in alchemy. There is a sympathy that will make me conscious of him. I shall see him tremble. I shall feel myself shudder suddenly and unawares. Sooner or later, he must needs be mine. You can hear it. You can hear how bad I am at this accent. The eyes of the wrinkled scholar glowed so intensely upon her that Hester Prynne clasped her hands over her heart, dreading lest he should read the secrets there at once. Thou wilt not reveal his name. Not the less he is mine, resumed he with a look of confidence, as if destiny were at one with him. It bears no letter of infamy wrought to his garment, and thou dost. But I shall read it on his heart, yet fear not for him. Think not that I shall interfere with heaven's own method of retribution, or to my own loss, betray him to the gripe of human law. Neither do thou imagine that I shall contrive aught against his life, no, nor against his fame. If, as I judge, he be a man of fair repute, let him live, let him hide himself in outward honour, if he may. Not the less he shall be mine. Thy acts are like mercy, said Hester, bewildered and appalled. But thy words are... Yeah, you're still the same person talking. But thy words interpret thee as terror. One thing thou, that wast my wife, I would enjoin upon thee, continued the scholar. Thou hast kept the secret of thy paramour, keep likewise mine. There are none in this land that know me, breathe not to any human soul that thou didst ever call me husband. Here on this wild outskirt of the earth, I shall pitch my tent, for elsewhere, a wanderer and isolated from the human interests, I find here a woman, a man, a child, amongst whom and myself there exists closest ligaments, no matter whether of love or hate, no matter whether of right or wrong. Thou and thine, Hester Prynne, belong to me. My home is where thou art, and where it is. Betray me not. Wherefore dost thou desire it? Inquired Hester, shrinking. He hardly knew why, from this secret bond. Why not announce thyself openly and cast me off at once? It may be, he replied, because I will not encounter the dishonor that besmirches the husband of a faithless woman. It may be for other reasons. Enough it is my purpose to live and die unknown. Let there before thy husband be to the world as one is already dead, and of whom no tidings shall ever come. Recognize me not by word, by sign, by look. Breathe not the secret above all to the man thou wottest of. Shouldst thou fail me in this, beware. His fame, his position, his life will be in my hands. Beware. I will keep thy secret as I have his, said Hester. Swear it, rejoined he, and she took the oath. And now, Mistress Prynne, said old Roger Chillingsworth, as he was hereafter to be named, I leave thee alone with thy infant in the scarlet letter. How is it, Hester? Doth thy sentence binds thee to wear the token in thy sleep? Art thou not afraid of nightmares and hideous dreams? Why dost thou smile so at me? Inquired Hester, troubled at the expression of his eyes. Art thou like a black man that haunts the forest about us? Hast thou enticed me into a bond that will prove the ruin of my soul? Not thy soul, he answered with another smile. No, not thine. And that is the end of that chapter. Cool. And so by black man, they actually mean, there's a little thing at the bottom here. It says the devil in Christian folklore. But it's also a reference to Native Americans and their religious beliefs. And the Puritans associated that with witchcraft. So the black man in the forest isn't like a black man in the forest. It's like the devil. So not as much racism as you would initially get out of this book. Man, do I look shiny. Cool. So, what did we get out of this chapter? What happened with good old Mr. Chillingsworth and Hester Prynne here? So Hester's sitting in her cell. The jailer is like, man, this woman just needs to chill because she's freaking out and the baby's yelling. And she's dealing with the embarrassment of everything that happened that day. And so a doctor's called in, and the doctor happens to be Mr. Chillingsworth, the guy she recognized in the audience with the sloped shoulders. That guy. so Mr. Chillingsworth comes in. He's like, he talks to the jailer. He's like, this woman won't be that much of a problem anymore. After I'm done with her, she's gonna be a lot more settled out. And so the jailer's like, that'd be amazing, cool. And so he leaves, and Chillingsworth sits down. He's like, let's take care of this baby first. He like picks up the baby, and he's like, cool. And he like gets some potions and stuff. He's like, I may have been a doctor before I was here in America, but when I've been in here in America, I've been learning all of the Native American ways to heal people. So I'm like double doctor. I tried to doctor twice and became a double doctor. And so now he's Doctor 2.0, and he starts mixing up this little potion-y thing. And he's like, okay, give this to your baby. I don't want to do it because I'm not the baby's dad, and I don't want the baby associating me with a father figure. Hint, hint. And she's like, okay. And I don't remember if she actually does it or if he does it, because she was kind of super hesitant about this whole affair. And so let's just assume he actually ends up giving the baby the potion. And so the baby calms down, falls asleep, and he's like, you know I'm your husband, right? And she's like, yep, I know that. You're not dead. It's like, nope, right here. Seems you abandoned me, then slept with somebody else. Kind of upset about that. And he said it in this terrible British accent that I have given him. And so he says, I kind of want revenge, but I don't want revenge in the way you think. I'm a good person, you know? Like, I understand that I was old when we first got together, and that your youth I shouldn't have tied down your youth, and that you ran from me or you separated from me in some way, and that was okay. So we went our separate ways and all that. But kind of upset with this dude you slept with. Kind of like, I get you're fine. I understand why you left, but not so happy with the guy you slept with. Don't want to ruin his reputation. I don't want to kill him. Just want him to know that he's mine. And I'm not really sure what any of that means, but that's what he wants. He wants to get this guy, and he wants to say, I exist. That was my wife that you slept with, and you're going to hell. Basically, I think that's how I'm interpreting this whole thing. And she's like, that's really merciful that you don't want to kill him, that you don't want to ruin his reputation. Still super creepy the way you're phrasing all this. Yep, you are old. I did leave you. And he's like, cool. Well, be nicer. And if you're not going to tell me who this guy is, and she's like, I'm not going to tell you who this guy is. Like, then I'm, if a guy commits himself to something enough, if he puts like all his effort into it, he can solve pretty much any mystery. So it's going to come out eventually. So you should probably, I know you're not going to tell me, but like, telling me would simplify things a bit. And she's like, nope. And he's like, cool. Well, glad we have this chat. Nobody's gonna die, but I'm definitely gonna figure out who this guy is. And she's like, okay. And I think he leaves. Yeah, no. He says it's inferred that he's gonna ruin his soul, because he's like, I'm not gonna ruin your soul. She's like, you're not gonna ruin, don't worry about it. He's gonna ruin this guy's soul, whoever it is. And so, yay, we did it. That was chapter 4, probably. Yep. And that's the end of that. So thanks for joining me, guys. Again, as always, if you have any questions at all, drop them down below. I can do a lot more analysis after I can like read spark notes and summaries and stuff like that. And I'm sure everyone around you can also help you. You just have to ask the questions and say your thoughts. And cool. Bye. See you in the next chapter. Welcome back to Micah Reads. We are on chapter 5 of Scarlet Letter by that guy Nathaniel Hawthorne, and I'm excited to get you through it. So, chapter 5, Hester at her needle. Hester Prym's term of confinement was now at an end. Her prison door was thrown open, and she came forth into the sunshine, which, falling on all alike, seemed to her sick and morbid heart, as if it meant for no other purpose than to reveal the scarlet letter on her breast. Perhaps there was some more real torture in her first unattended footsteps from the threshold of the prison than ever in the procession and spectacle that have been described, where she was made the common infamy, at which all mankind was summoned to point its finger. Then she was supported by an unnatural tension of the nerves and by all the combative energy of her character, which enabled